earlier. Actually, before we talk about Jaylen Brown, kind of want to send a quick prayers to Bronny James and the LeBron James family. I know that he had a sudden cardiac arrest yesterday, so I hope that he and his family are doing well. It's a scary sight to see such a young athlete get a very serious medical emergency like that. So again, prayers up to Bronny James and the rest of the James family.
Yeah, 100%. Glad it got caught. Glad he's all right from everything we've heard so far.
Exactly. But kind of changing subjects here, we are now going to go to the Jaylen Brown and the Celtics have finally agreed to what is the biggest deal ever in NBA history, and that's of course signing a 5-year, $304 million extension supermax. Of course know that contract. Brown's contract is fully guaranteed and has a trade kicker. Brown, however, does not have a player option as part of the deal. Brown qualified for the Supermax after making an All NBA team this past season and is ineligible to be traded until the 2024 offseason after the extension. Pete, this is a really big contract. I think it's going to, obviously, we talked about this a lot. I think the Mike Conley contract is a contract that comes to mind. Uh, what do you make of this contract? Is it a good signing? Is it bad? Like, what do you make of Jaylen Brown signing this? And where do you see it going from here on out?
I gotta say, this is one of the more conflicting Supermax contracts in recent memory, as far as I'm concerned, for me. And I say that for a couple reasons. I think one, like obviously, this is where a lot of people I've seen just don't really get the business side of the league, right? Like the Celtics had to do this. They had to. There was no option for them. You
Mm-hmm.
can't you can't go into this off season and regardless of how Jaylen Brown played in the playoffs, regardless if he has a left hand, regardless whatever you want to say about his game, right? He is in a category of player that instantly is going to get the Supermax extension. That's just the way the league works. And the Celtics are in a position where you can't let these types of guys walk for nothing, right? The hard part is you have to and I don't know if you're going to push back on this, Bernie. I think it's a fair question to say whether or not Jaylen Brown is a top 20 player. He's right there, right? Regardless if he's over that cusp or not. He's right there. But it still has to sting to be paying a guy that's certainly not in the top 12 players in the league more money than all the other guys. That's really tough to swallow. But yeah, man, I don't know. I think they had to do it, but he's not the type of guy I would have wanted to break the record if I'm the one paying these contracts out. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? How do you feel as a Celtics fan? I would assume your feelings are very strong on this one way or the other at the very least.
Yeah. I mean, I think the clear thing is, of course, the contract had to be signed. I think the way that the league works now, unfortunately, I think that this is I would say, frustrating part about the league is that really, I think these super maxes have become not in terms of them getting their money. Like, I'll never hate on anybody getting their money, but in terms of salary cap implications and things like that, it really ties up an organization. And really, I'm thinking more for the small markets. I mean, Boston will be fine, but I'm thinking more for the small markets. Like, they have their hands tied and can't, uh, sign a lot of the guys that they want to. Sign some pieces here and there. Like, it's crazy to me that teams like the Milwaukee Bucks and even the Denver Nuggets even won a championship because of the fact that for the most part, like when you pay someone the super max, like that is basically kind of being handcuffed in a way, right? Because most of
Mm-hmm.
your salary cap percentage goes to that star player. Um, and so, I think for me, like this had to get done. I'm excited for Jaylen Brown to get this super max deal. Because again, it's similar to what happened with Mike Conley, right? Mike Conley signed the super max many years ago and was the highest paid player at one point in this league. I
Mm-hmm.
do think that Brown is a top 15 player in the NBA. Now, is he closer towards the end of the 15? That's probably up for debate, and I'd probably say that that's kind of where I rank him at. But to get to the nitty gritty of this whole thing, I think, like you said, it's a very conflicting thing because on one end, I'm very happy that Jaylen Brown has decided to stay. But the other chance, it's kind of one of those things where I just don't want to continue to see the same style of basketball being played these last
Mhm.
couple years continue on for more years longer. Like these two guys, just as um, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, like these players have to understand that there's no longer your turn, my turn type of thing. We can't get into that sort of argument. We can't get into that style of play, and I hope Joe Mazzulla is in the offseason cooking right now. Especially making sure that those guys are working on their game and working on if they're gonna drive, make sure that they don't drive on clogged lanes because
Yep.
we saw that in the Golden State series a couple years back, and now we even saw that in the Miami Heat series. Like they clogged the lanes, they got both of those players to their left, from a behind the back or
Mhm.
whatever move it is, and they were able just to poke it out and go the other way with it for an easy fast break. And so, that's kind of my sort of pessimist side about things. But in terms of what Jaylen Brown brings. I think he does bring that superstar ability and quality to the Celtics. I think with Porzingis, I would love to see how it works out with those guys. Maybe it does help out in some sense.
Mhm.
But like you said, at the same time, it's kind of one of those things where you have to look at it and say, is he worth the supermax as being the top paid player in the whole league? Probably not. But I think it's just the reality of when they sign these contracts.
Yeah.
If there's a new TV deal coming in, there's going to be another player next year that's going to make even more money. And so
True.
that's kind of I think that's kind of the reality of this Supermax contract. And what I would like to see happen, really, Pete, is that I would love to see that these Supermaxes don't, and maybe this is just me being like anti what the new CBA deal is going through, but I just don't want to see uh, really what I don't want to see is that these teams, I'm really thinking more so for the Oklahoma City Thunders, who have to probably in a couple years down the line have to have the similar discussion about Chet Holmgren, about Josh Giddey, and all these other guys that are coming through their youth program.
Yep.
They're gonna have to make decisions like this, and so I hate that it has to like hamstring or shoe tie any of these players that are trying to have a super team or create an organic super team in a way where you have drafted these guys, and it really is going to hamstring these organizations. So that's kind of my whole synopsis on it. I know it kind of went in many different directions, but that's kind of what my initial thinking was when I saw this contract being signed.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, this is really one of the most conflicting ones ever. Like I said, like there's a lot of stuff going on that is kind of irrelevant to Jaylen Brown, particularly, right? Like the way that the CBA was renegotiated, the way that supermaxes are in the league right now. It all was leading towards somebody getting this contract. Whether or not it was Jaylen Brown was kind of, definitely up for debate. He just happened to be in the perfect place at the right time contractually, right? To be in this type of leverage situation. I can't lie to you, Bernie. I'm always pretty conflicted about like one or two guys making like 80% of the team's money. Like I'm always going to be conflicted about that. And
Mm-hmm.
that maybe that's just a personal thing in terms of um I just find it really hard to believe in a professional setting when you're at that level. And it's always going to be as simple as, he deserves that. I'll just be okay making 1%. I just don't think that there's always going to be animosity. And whether or not that's a big deal or not is definitely up for debate. Jaylen Brown deserves to be one of the higher played players in the NBA. That's not even a question. It's the fact that I, I, I don't know about you, Bernie. You're probably going to disagree with this, but I would classify Jaylen in not in the totality of his game, but I do think in a lot of ways he's a sloppy basketball player. Okay. I think he makes a lot of dumb choices. And I think he kind of, obviously leans into his athleticism in the sense that he thinks he can get away with things that he can't really get away with. And you pointed it out in terms of the way he dribbles, obviously is not necessarily the greatest,
Mm-hmm.
but in particular, he leaves himself exposed to get the ball poked away from him very often, regardless of what hand he's dribbling with. It happens, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a strange thing to think about. You're a sloppy player who has a huge hole in your game that everybody knows about, yet you're still the highest paid guy in the league. There's going to be all sorts of people who feel a certain type of way about that. So I'm interested really to see the response from other players around the league. I think obviously the guys at the top are going to be like, you're setting us all up for success in the long run. But there is a question of like, is this dude even happy in Boston? you know,
Yeah, I mean,
is he going to be happy there after the 2024 during the 2024 offseason when that extension, is he's able to be traded? I, I'm not sure, man. I think that this is going to be a huge tell. Like,
yeah.
if we keep having these guys get these exorbitant deals where it is literally crippling to the rest of your franchise,
Hmm.
and the trend is that after a year or two, if it's not going perfect, they're going to take that huge contract and try and walk with it. It's a tough pill to swallow for these guys paying the contracts out, and I will never be on their side of things, but you do have to wonder like what the response is. There's got to be a lot of teams looking at this saying like, let's see what happens with Jaylen Brown. Do we want to give out $70 million a year, type contracts? I don't think there's a lot of teams that could, let alone want to. Um, but it'll be interesting, man. I don't know, Bernie. I don't know about this one. I don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, I just think at
I
the
I
end.
hope it works out for everybody. I do.
Yeah, I mean, I just think at the end of the day, what it all boils down to really is, I really do think that this all just boils down to what the offense surrounds Jaylen Brown, and really, I think for the most part, what the Celtics will have to do is to limit, not necessarily limit his dribbles, but more so limit the opportunities for him to have to make any more like counter moves than he needs to, right? I think it goes really, I think the play style more so than anything else. And I know my chair is sinking, and I feel like I'm sinking into like 4'6" here on the channel, and I'm already short as it is. But I just think for the most part, the biggest thing is going to be these guys, both Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. And you know how I feel about Jason Tatum working with Drew Hanlon. I don't want to get into a conversation about that, but the big thing for me is really, how do we limit and don't allow these players, and that means so more so for Joe Mazzulla, like how do we get them to understand, okay, if one move or two moves don't work, you got to move it and let's play team basketball. Like, I just feel like all these dribble moves and everything that both Tatum and Brown and now even Paulo, I think, is training with Jason Tatum and Drew Hanlon. So I'm praying for Paulo there. Um,
Yeah.
like, how are those moves going to help you win and play team basketball? Like, yes, you can get yours in December against the Denver Nuggets, when Jokic is out, or, the trying to think of really bad teams like the Houston Rockets, the Detroit Pistons. Like, yeah, you can get yours against those guys. Like, I understand, like, that's where you can get like most of your buckets from all those moves.
Yeah.
But what are you going to do in the playoffs, right? The Orlando Magic, I have high expectations for them to, and maybe this is early predictions, but I have high expectations of them to get at least close to the play-in game. How is your game? And I know that this is going on Paulo, but like, maybe more so for the Celtics, like, how is your game going to elevate when you play against these teams? Like, there's no way the Celtics should have struggled or even lost game one against the 76ers last year. I think that there was a couple games for the Celtics. I mean, they shouldn't have lost the Miami Heat series. Like, they should have won that series and
No.
gone to the
Yeah.
NBA Finals. So I think, like, by looking at that and seeing everything, the Celtics need to do a much better job, that being Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and whoever is training with these guys that are doing these dribble moves when it feels like it's 1v5 and not 5v5. I just think the less dribbles, the less of these moves, the better for some of these guys, because they clearly, um, they're good in, like I said, December, January games. But when it comes to finally getting into that NBA postseason, how are you going to play? And that's my concern with this whole thing.
Well, and let me ask you a question though, Bernie. I guess, and I'm somewhat playing devil's advocate, but I, to an extent, have to ask this question legitimately too. You know, should you really be the highest paid player if the fans of your team and the team itself has to worry about that type of stuff? Like, genuinely. I get that the business deems, like, I am fully aware. The way that the NBA's business is set up currently in its current capacity, he had to get that contract or he was going to walk and get something similar to it somewhere else. It's just
Mm.
the way it is right now, right? But don't you think that there's a problem with that? Like, I'm sorry. I just don't think that, like, even if you compare him to his contemporaries, Bernie, like, let's say, I mean, you're not worrying about stuff like that with Jokic or Giannis or any, like, really, you're not. It's just, I find it very interesting that we're in a day and age where you have guys that genuinely have questions about their performance in these big moments, but just because they're eligible for it, we all deem that it's just mandatory. It's just mandatory that he becomes the highest paid because it's the time, place, and he deserves a supermax. But the question is, like, how many people could you put in the same exact situation as Jaylen Brown? And I know that he's really, really great. I'm not trying to really take too much away from him, right? But he does get a ton of leeway on the team he's in. He was a high draft pick who had a lot invested in him, right? How many people could be in that position with all the opportunity he's had and maximize their effort and not be that far off of where he is, Bernie? You know what I'm saying? Like, I just find it interesting that we have guys like Caleb Martin, for example, who he was working Jaylen Brown in some of those games in the Heat series. And that dude is, way closer to a league minimum than Jaylen Brown's contract. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I just, you have to question, man, like, is there longevity in these type of deals? Are these organizations that are selling themselves out for these types of contracts, are they really, like, hamstringing themselves 5 years from now? Because
Uh,
really, what happens if they never win a championship with this team and he's the highest paid player of all time, and then they have to do the same thing for Tatum in whenever, 3 years or 2 years, whatever it is?
yeah. I mean, I do agree in a sense because, I talked about it actually yesterday. For the
Mhm.
people that didn't know, we talked about ESPN and the new revenue thing that they're going to go with by giving, stakeholder shares or, a minority ownership of ESPN to NBA, NFL, MLB. Like, they're looking into that because I think you're right, Pete. Like, this is going to be a very troubling time because to me, this offseason is starting to eerily feel like I think it was 2016, if I'm not mistaken. The
Yeah, 2016,
2016,
17.
16, 17 NBA offseason where you had like guys like Mozgov, you had guys like Otto
Alan
Porter
Crabbe.
Jr. getting these huge contracts, which, for being a specialist in your role, is great, for those guys. But like you said, it does hamstring a lot of the organizations out there. The one to me is like the Lakers. It hamstrung them until they were finally able to make this trade and get LeBron James on their team.
Mhm.
I do think that eventually it will, and I'm curious to see like if the TV deals are now going to stagnate a little bit because now they're going to offer ownership. Does that mean that the contracts of the superstar players goes down? That's going to be a big question mark that, I just kind of thought about it as you were talking. It's kind of one of the concerns or
Mhm.
one of the things that I'm curious to see what happens. But, I do think at some point the money does have to plateau. I know inflation accounts for everything, and I know this is not an economics channel, but, eventually, like, there's going to be a cap to where they're going to pay these players. I don't necessarily think it's going to continue to go up forever and ever because, you know, it'll be interesting to see like what happens in the future with the way that gaming is going to work. Not like video games, but more so like, you know, AI and virtual reality and what's going to happen with the stadium. Like that's a question that I'm curious to see what
Sure.
happens. And I know
Yeah.
that that's a conversation for a different day. Um,
And what you're saying, I think, is super valid, Bernie. Because really, think about it like this, right? They're gonna. How do you pay these mega contracts, right? What even is it that's actually being, like, quantified that qualifies these guys to make this crazy amount of money? The answer is pretty simple. It's revenue. It's revenue not only from deals that the league and the teams have with companies, but
mhm.
even more so the people who buy the tickets and go to
Yeah.
the games. And really, that's the thing that I think is, like, the least talked about. And I hate to always get on my old guy, sounding like a socialist type thing. I'm not, okay? But I do think that there has to be a sense of accountability with these types of contracts, right? Because realistically, we all celebrate Jaylen Brown like a lot of people celebrate, these guys getting the bag. All credit to them, man. But really, what's the difference between $225 million and 300 if you really, stop and think about it, right? If your percentage
Mhm.
is close to, closer to being fair with the other guys on your team, not just the other guys on your team, but the other people in the league and your contemporaries and your peers, there has to be a question of, am I really worth 10 times more than Caleb Martin as a basketball player? And I hate to keep harping on it, but it has to be discussed because there is no way, based on purely performance, that Caleb Martin will ever make his way to a contract like Jaylen Brown just did. And that is not fair. That's
Mhm.
not fair, Bernie. Like, I hate to be the fair police. But that's crazy because then you have guys like Caleb Martin who's busting his butt every day to get better as a
Mhm.
basketball player. He's defending at the highest level. He's performing in the biggest moments with both hands. Okay. And I'm not just trying to throw shade at Jaylen because there's a ton of people who qualify in what I'm talking about. Damian Lillard is another great example, making $65 million dollars in his final couple of years, doesn't play defense. I find that really hard to swallow when you have other guys doing everything, making way less because they're way less notable of names. But then
Mhm.
also the fact that these teams are going to have to raise prices for everything and make it harder on fans to pay these contracts. That's crazy to me. But they'll never say that out loud, but that is what it is, you know? It
Yeah.
He deserves it based on the way the league is. I'm not even disagreeing with it. I just think I'm very interested to see um like
Mhm.
we're really getting into like a 1% of the league type situation, like there's one percenters now in just that system of
Yeah.
economy, right? That's
Yeah.
pretty strange, man. There's going to be animosity from a lot of people going towards those types of guys,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially if Jaylen Brown doesn't get better.
Yeah. And I think this is going to lead to probably a lot of different conversations, different routes, talking about all this. But it is going to be interesting to find out in the future where the league heads. And like I talked about in yesterday's video, especially when it comes to ESPN and their decline and stuff like that. Um, I think eventually that these players are turning into content creators, right? Where they're
Hmm.
they're selling their their content creator likeness to the leagues so that they can make the money that they do. And so I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the future. I think it's going to be very fascinating what goes on as soon as especially as these contracts continue to increase. I'm sure we're going to eventually get to the 5-year, $500 million contract in the next couple of years. I would say the next 2 to 3, actually maybe 5 to 7 might be
Who
the
is it?
timeline.
Who's your bet? Who's the first one?
I think it's got to be someone either in this. It's got to be someone in this year's class. I think Victor could potentially get it.
You don't think
Um,
Luca might be the guy?
I just don't know if Luca's. I don't think if
The
Luca's
timeline?
timeline works to get to
Yeah.
that contract. I think these young guys, the rookies, are gonna probably get there. Even Paulo might get there, but maybe Paulo might be a year too late.
You might be
But
right. Here, let's talk one last thing before we get off this topic because I think this is interesting. Well, let's get away from the what we've been how we've been talking about it, whether it's right or wrong, whatever, any of that type of stuff. Let's get away from that. Let's just talk about it is the way it is going forward. How do you make something like this manageable? And I've heard this type of idea floated around before, but I think they're really painting themselves into a corner with this situation. And the MLS has a very similar policy like what I'm about to discuss. That we're seeing it with Messi right now with the Miami team. I don't even know what they're called. Miami FC, is that what they're called?
Inter
Uh,
Miami FC, yeah,
yeah, they have contracts. They have I think it's 3 contracts per team in the MLS that don't go against the salary cap, right?
yeah,
They're gonna have to do something like that. I don't think it's gonna be
yeah,
3 players. That would be pretty extreme. But like at least you get one, maybe you get one supermax that counts for 15% towards the salary
Mhm.
cap of what it
Yeah.
should. Like, what do you think is their best methodology going forward? Like, what do you think is the best solution in terms of if we're not going to change how much these guys are making and make it more reasonable, which
Yeah.
does that seems like it's going to be the case. We're just going to keep going forward. How do you think they should fix it
Yeah, I think
or
that they're
make it
probably gonna do.
manageable?
Yeah, I was gonna say they're probably gonna do something similar to what the MLS is gonna do. I talked a little bit about it. I just you have to at some point because, like I talked about, the Oklahoma City Thunder are gonna be in that same predicament in the next couple of years. These teams that have these young players that have been drafting for many years are gonna be in the similar situation where they're gonna have to decide. The Orlando Magic will probably be there as well, along with the Thunder. Who do you
Hmm.
keep and who do you get rid of? And I know that these teams do not want to get rid of talent, especially the small market teams, where it's already hard enough to draft those guys and to even keep them, other than
Yep.
offering them the max money that you can. You have to offer a deal where you can say, hey, like you said, 15%, 20% of it uh, goes against the salary cap. The rest of it we'll just eat. Um, I think you're gonna have to do something like that, and I think it's probably you're gonna have to limit it to one. But if you do limit it to one, I think it does have to be by the team that drafts you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't
Which
want
I
to,
think that would be an added bonus,
yeah,
realistically. That
because
would
now
incentivize small market teams.
exactly it would incentivize it. Like think about if instead of Jaylen Brown, you put uh, let's do someone on the Thunder here. Let's do say Gildish Alexander, right? Shea. You obviously want him on that team, and now you have to decide the rest of it, man. It's kind of one of those things I want to continue to monitor, because I do think that that's probably where the league is going to head towards in the future. um but I even will see that because the CBA, they are, I know CJ McCollum was part of that. I think he's the vice president, I think, or he's the
I think he's the
president.
president. Yeah.
He is very anti super teams, and so I'm curious to see if they'll even agree to that.
He might be anti super team, but based on whatever negotiations they did in that CBA, I'm sorry he didn't do a good job of showing it. I'll just tell you that much because really this is it killed the middle class of players contracts, and then they just made it even more like these teams are even more reliant upon these supermax guys. Like really, that's that's all it is. Um, I think you're onto something. I think it would be really interesting. What if it's like, is the OKC is a great example because going under what we're talking about, they didn't draft SGA, so they would be
Yeah.
in a funny situation where let's say he came up for an extension, but they also are thinking about giving the supermax to Chet, right?
Yeah.
Like there would be maybe like one that's classified different, like one that pertains specifically to a person you drafted, right? And that, let's say, if you drafted a guy and he's been on your team since made the pick,
Mm-hmm.
it's 0% against the cap. And then let's say he's somebody you traded for or signed in free agency, that would count as like 15%, right? Because then
Mm-hmm.
it truly would incentivize giving super maxes from small markets even more, right? Because then
Yeah.
it's even less against it's going to be really fascinating. I'm interested to see,
Yeah.
regardless.
Because I just feel like super maxes right now are kind of the the nail in the coffin for a lot of these small market teams because, like, yeah, we can pay you a ton of money, but we're gonna have nothing left for you. Uh,
Yeah, is it worth it? Like, is it even worth it in 5 years to say we signed Jaylen Brown to? Because I think one of the things that's really interesting, Bernie, let's say Jaylen Brown, we're 3 years into this contract and he still has no left hand and gets the ball stripped from him all the time, right? That contract is an albatross. That's impossible to move. Nobody's taking a $70 million a year guy with a trade kicker who can't dribble on his left, right? Like that's
mm-hmm.
insanity. So really, I think the long-term planning in terms of how you determine who's worth, maybe truly that's going to be what's going to slow this down. There's going to have to be maybe three or four, instances where it goes horrifically wrong and these teams are just stuck with a guy that's immovable. Because really, the one I thought is the worst that we've seen in recent memory, Bernie, is Bradley Beal. That one's terrible. I mean, they had to give the dude away to get that contract out of there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but even then, they still managed to move it. So, is
Yeah.
anything immovable? I guess I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's going to be the interesting question to monitor as we continue to look at these big contracts. So let us know in the comment section down below. What do you guys make of these big contracts? Are you a big fan of them? Are you not a big fan of them? Let us know in the comment section down below how you feel about Jaylen Brown Supermax. And do you think that this is more of a negative or a positive for small market teams that they have to pay a Supermax? Let us know in the comment section down below.